Hello everybody! If you don't know me, my name's Greg Jarvis, and I live up here in Georgetown, on and off during the year. But just wanted to welcome you tonight. There's a can in the back for your donations. These go to the Support the Community Center here. And just to give you a little bit of update of what's coming up on our talks this year. What's the NHLD and HDPLC? You guys know what those are? Anybody? No. Christine knows, that's true. But I'll be speaking on that. I'm the executive director of the HDPLC, and I realize that a lot of people don't know what it is, but it's a major player here in town and part of the National Historic Landmark District, which is what the other letters stand for. But I'll go through that next month. We're going to have a conversation in January on the Floyd Hill archaeological sites. I've heard a little bit about that. That should be amazing in January. And then 150 years of the Presbyterian Church. Norman and Pam will be talking on that in February. And I've got a pending topic for Kevin Kuharik.
I just stopped Kevin in the middle of 6th Street and said, how about May? So I don't really have like a title. Kevin will do something is the title.
And it will be wonderful. So, and John's going to be back to talk about mushrooms in April. And I will be back in May to talk about pack burro racing right before our annual pack burro race that will be in May. It will be about 9 days after I do that talk. And I've become a pack burro racer over the last few years, but would love to share that history with everybody here. So tonight's talk is about another look at James Grafton Rogers after we had an introduction and a great talk last year on that presented by John. My friend here, Rex, is going to talk about it, and Rex knows this music of the American West, the songs of the explorers, fur traders, and Civil War soldiers, and he sings the music of the early settlers of the Mountain West, and I've heard a lot personally. I've been a friend of Rex for over 30 years, and during that time I've enjoyed numerous performances from music at the fort down in Morrison, different mountain rendezvous that I've traveled to back when our kids were really little, to cowboy Christmas concerts in Conifer that he puts on annually, and he's done 2 other presentations here in Georgetown. We celebrated the life of John Denver by singing John's music at a mountain chuck wagon just shortly after John Denver's passing. And we've also been able to enjoy a few turns on the slopes up in Loveland since I retired. So enjoying the daytime skiing during the midweek up there. But professionally, Rex has performed at countless historic sites and museums across the West, playing his fiddle, banjo, as you see down here, mandolin, and other instruments. His music's been featured on television and radio, such as CBS Sunday Mornings, museums like the Buffalo Bill Center of the West, and the Western American Art Collection at the Denver Art Museum, and the American Museum of Western Art. His work has also been parts of soundtracks for 4 National Park Service Visitor Center films, the PBS film Badger Clark, and the blockbuster film Cowboys and Aliens. Watch that. He's in the bar playing banjo. Fiddle. Oh, that's right. Play something happier. But you're in for an awesome evening. He has some guests here that I'm sure he'll introduce here that everybody will love to meet. And you're in for an exciting evening of history and music. And please join me in welcoming my friend Rex Rideout.
to start out by thanking Devil's Gate and all of you good folks in Georgetown for inviting me back. It's good to be back here. And I am especially thankful that Cora Lou was able to join us this evening. I'm glad that she is here.
I just want to say welcome to everybody. And I'm at a dither because I can't tell you what's happening. So if anybody knows tonight and next night, go ahead and speak up.
We got it.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, my oxygen was not going, and I know somebody at the house that wanted to be here, but this car's not running.
Well,
I apologize. So thank you all for being here.
Well, I did take note that there was a particularly impressive presentation by Allison and John about Elizabeth Bird and James Grafton Rogers earlier this year, and I thought that's going to be a tough act to follow. However, I think I have some other material to add to the conversation, and I'm trying to reduce the overlap. And to begin, we want to talk about James Grafton Rogers. He was born in 1883, and this is easy for me to remember because my grandfather Charles Dyer was born in 1883 as well. He was born to parents Maria Georgiana Dare Burrell and Edmund James Armstrong Rogers, both of Ontario. Edmund was from a village called Grafton, which is about 30 miles east of Toronto. And that got me thinking, how did that name Grafton get into the family name? And I thought perhaps there was someone on his mother's family or his grandmother's family. And so I started looking for his ancestors, and I did not find any Grafton name. But I found that his grandfather was also James Grafton Rogers, born in 1805. His great-grandfather is David MacGregor Rogers, good Scottish name. He was born in 1772. And then I got to James Rogers, born in 1728, and I thought, wait, just a moment. And I did some looking, and I found that James' brother is Robert Rogers, Colonel E. Robert Rogers of Rogers Rangers. And that came as a surprise to me. This has been something that was implied by friends and family over the years, and even famously by James himself naming his son Ranger. But I have found direct lineage between Rogers Rangers and James Grafton Rogers in just 4 generations. And I have looked through other sources, and I am confident that this is so. And if you haven't heard of Rogers Rangers, they were heroes in the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War. They were the first of the light infantry. They practiced guerrilla tactics. They wore green uniforms as an early form of camouflage to blend in. But then came the revolution, and now it's time to choose sides between the colonies and the mother country. And actually, Robert Rogers reported to General Washington, but he was dismissed by General Washington because he did not trust the man. And so Robert joined with his comrades in England, and the war did not turn out in their favor. And so Robert Rogers lived out the rest of his days in London. But James, like so many of his comrades, they settled in Ontario, in Canada. And there is the lineage going down to James Grafton Rogers. I do want to mention James' brother, Edmund. And he was the superintendent of Rocky Mountain National Park from 1929 to 1936. And then from 1936 to 1956, he was the superintendent of Yellowstone. He had an outstanding career in the National Park Service. and now I'm back to James. He graduated from Yale in 1905, and all through his life he was proud to say he was a Yale man. He graduated from the Denver Law School in 1908. He was professor there in 1910. That same year he married Cora May Peabody. Cora was a daughter of James Hamilton Peabody, the former governor of Colorado. James and Cora were co-founders of 3 children. Ranger Rogers, born in 1912, who would marry Rowena. Lorna, who would marry Mr. Stephen Hart. And Hamilton, who would marry Katie Rogers. 1912 was also when James was co-founder of something else, and that was the Colorado Mountain Club. And from what I can find, it seems like a big impetus, a big catalyst for the Colorado Mountain Club was solely to create Rocky Mountain National Park, from things that I have read, and Dinosaur National Monument. There was an invitation from Robert B. Marshall, the chief geographer of U.S. Geological Survey. Rogers drafted a bill to the establishment of Rocky Mountain National Park. This was introduced to the House of Representatives February 6, 1913, and then into the Senate the following day. Enos Mills was a fellow member of the Colorado Mountain Club, and he and James worked together to establish this national park. Not always amicably. Seems like Enos Mills was a man of passion, but Rogers was a man of patience. He had to write 3 separate park bills and 5 separate revisions over the course of the years. But Rocky Mountain National Park was established January 26, 1915. Dinosaur National Monument was established October 4th of 1915. And you may have seen recently on Channel 6, PBS, there was the 100th anniversary of the Rocky Mountain National Park. And I enjoyed very much seeing that program, but there is not one mention of James Grafton Rogers in that documentary. At the outset of World War I, actually it was when the U.S. entered the war in 1917, James enlisted in the Army. He was a field officer and tactics instructor, or as Stephen Hart would say, he was involved in European affairs and artillery tactics in the Army for World War I. In 1920, he was president of the Cactus Club. In 1925, president of the Colorado Bar Association. And then in 1931 to 1933, he was Assistant Secretary of State under President Hoover. In this position, he was in charge of negotiations with Canada over the development of the St. Lawrence Seaway. The man wore many hats. He caught the attention of Drew Pearson in Washington. Drew Pearson published what he called the Washington Merry-Go-Round. And in 1933, he wrote of Rogers, "The yodeling lawyer, the absolute antithesis of the stodginess and formality of the Foreign Service." He approved of James Rogers. Well, in 1928 through 1931, he was professor of law at the University of Colorado School of Law, and then dean in 1933 through 1935. In 1832, he was Western Vice President of the American Alpine Club. In 1938, he was president of that organization. And then in 1941, war breaks out in Europe again. And he is looking for a secure place to meet with heads of state somewhere in the interior of our country. And it was Ranger that found a good home for that purpose. And that was the Aspen Grove, which was up on the slope over here. And that was purchased in 1941. And later that year, the Secretary of State, Secretary of War, met with Rogers there at what he called the Aspen Grove. In time, that Secretary of War was Marshall, and in time Rogers would work through him, work negotiations, and that led to overcoming a bit of a logjam and back in Washington, and it led to the development of the 10th Mountain Division Corps. In 1942 to 1943, James was Deputy Director of the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. And that can best be explained in the book, Wartime Washington, Secret OSS Journal of James Grafton Rogers, 1942 to 1943. And I know some of you have seen this book. This was edited by Thomas Troy. And when I first got the book, I was pleased to see that the copyrights go to James and Cora's children. In order, Lorna. Sometimes she's called Laura. Is that right?
I never knew it that way, no.
I should stop right here and say that I am honored that we have relatives of James Grafton Rogers who are here. There is James Grafton Rogers Hart of Stephen Hart, his wife Barbara, and we have Michael.
Yeah. Who's his great-great-grandson.
So I'm honored that they came up the highway in the weather and were able to join us today.
Thank you.
Yes.
But, Wartime Washington, if you think you know James Grafton Rogers, I invite you to get a copy of this book. And you will learn some other sides of the man and what he can do under pressure. In 1949, he was the president of the State Historical Society of Colorado. He was not idle in that position. And then in 1953 through 1955, he moved into his home up on the slope here, the Aspen Grove, and took up the position of mayor of Georgetown, or as he preferred to call it, police judge in accordance with the old mining regulations. He was also mayor in 1957 through 1955, but he also was able to pursue some of his personal interests, the one being, as James and I were just speaking of earlier, that he took up printing with the old printing presses. And in the archives at History Colorado, you can find examples of that printing. And he was proud to use the old fonts and the styles. And particularly there are Christmas cards that he was sending out, making them through that printing press. It was also in Georgetown that he became friends with Marcellus Merrill. And I know some of you know some stories with Marcellus and James, and I'm limited in my time, but I did want to say that Marcellus is known as developing the 3-pin cross-country ski binding, which I still use. I don't know about you, but it works for me.
Yep.
And it was through Marcellus Merrill that I first heard about James Grafton Rogers' affection for British Royal Navy grog. This is a recipe that goes way back to the days of the Empire and the sailing vessels. And it's a simple recipe. One part sour, 2 parts sweet, 3 parts strong, 4 parts weak. That is sour lemon or lime juice, sweet sugar, strong rum, 4 weak water. But James, he modified the recipe a little bit. And he would rely on the sweetness of the rum, and he left out the sugar. And actually, that's the way I prefer it myself. In 1962, in the spring, James and Cora bid farewell to Georgetown and moved to Denver. Cora was not well, and the highway was coming. And I've heard that it was through his negotiations and perhaps some of his connections with the federal government that there were plans to run the highway through this town, and instead he was able to arrange that it be up on the slope, and he saved the town at the expense of his own home. The Aspen Grove, we were discussing that earlier today, just where it was up on the slope. And I thought it was lost. Until I had looked at his one book, My Rocky Mountain Valley, and I saw a photograph of the house. And then I'm driving up Juan El Paso, as I always do, and there's the house on 2nd Street. And I pull over and I get my camera out, and I'm out there taking pictures, and a guy comes out of the house, and I say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, this is James Grafton Rogers' house." "I know." He goes back in the house, he brings out the Rocky Mountain Valley book, and we go talking about James. We had a great time. It was immediately after I got home, I contacted Katie Lee, and I'll get to Katie Lee in a little bit. But Katie had thought the house was destroyed, and she was so delighted to see photographs that it still exists. As I was saying, James published his book, My Rocky Mountain Valley, which was an almanac of this mountainous area, the flora and the fauna, as it would progress through the years. He published that in 1968. And it wasn't not long after that that Cora was gone. And then James moved to the University Club in Denver. And it was in March 20, 1971, that Katie Lee came to interview him. She wanted to interview him because she was going to have a film. She was going to make a film about Rogers and the song Old Dolores, which she loved so much. In time, she sent that cassette tape to me, and I was shocked and alarmed. And she said, "You hang on to that, you'll find something to do with it." And I have since digitized it, and the Devil's Gate group and other people have copies of that now. It is something that needs to be shared and saved. Well, she was going to come back, and she was going to do a film, motion picture film of James Rogers, but he died April 23rd, 1971, and so that never came to pass. And so James Grafton Rogers, his most eventful life, being so many people in one body, he left this earth. Now I'm going to jump ahead to 2010. It was the celebration of the 50th anniversary of Bensold Fort, June 5th, 2010. We had quite a celebration there, and at one point in the day there were presentations about how Bensold Fort came to be a National Historic Site. The program was called The Movers and Shakers Get It Done, Establishment of a National Historic Site. The speakers were in order: myself, William Convery of History Colorado, Merrill Eisenhower Atwater, grandson of President Eisenhower, and Holly Kinney Arnold, who was daughter of Sam Arnold. Sam Arnold built the Fort Restaurant down outside of Morrison, the house that Sam built. And the National Park Service hired Sam as a consultant when they were building or rebuilding Bensold Fort in time for the grand opening in 1976. So that's why Sam was there and Holly was representing him. This is an outline of what was discussed during those presentations. In 1920, the La Junta chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution, from this point on I will refer to as the DAR, they accepted the Benz Fort site. February 8th, 1926, there was a warranty deed issued from the Bench Fort Land and Cattle Company to the La Junta Chapter DAR. October 9, 1953, Stephen H. Hart, James Grafton Rogers, and the State Historical Society set up the Bench Fort Restoration Advisory Committee. In 1954, the State Historical Society, in their annual report, they restate the intention for the restoration of Bensold Fort to a museum. And I should stop and say, Bensold Fort is a fur trade fort that was first built out of adobe on the banks of the Arkansas River, just outside of La Junta. In June 1954, 4.41 acres of land is deeded to the state of Colorado, the State Historical Society by the La Junta DAR, and this is through the work of Rogers and Hart. In 1957, a 5-foot adobe outer wall is built. Schools and others collect funds. Later that year, Rogers suggests to Senator John A. Carroll that the National Park Service take Bent's Fort and the Pike's Stockade. Maybe you haven't heard of the Pike's Stockade. That is south of Alamosa. Zebulon Pike was leading his men to reconnoiter the southwest after the Louisiana Purchase, rather like the Lewis and Clark expedition. He got over the Sangre de Cristos and settled into the valley, and they built this stockade to protect them from the elements and any hostiles. Well, there is a replica of that fort standing today, but I sure wonder what it would be like if the National Park Service had in fact taken that up. But they did follow Rogers' urgings on Bent's Fort, and in June 3rd, 1960, President Eisenhower signs Public Law 86-487 to the 86th Congress, authorizing the establishment of a National Historic Site at Bent's Old Fort near La Junta, Colorado. And now I'm backing up again. 1953, Katie Lee, she's singing, playing guitar, having fun with her friends in Arizona. They're having what she called a jam. And they're just singing songs. And Singing Sam Aggins, I don't know if anyone's ever heard of Singing Sam Aggins, but he produced a few records and he was a remarkable man. He was disabled. He couldn't walk. He could walk with crutches, but he suffered from polio when he was a child. And he was an entertainer. He didn't let that stop him. Katie heard from Singing Sam Aggins the song Old Dolores and was smitten. She was in love. Where does this song come from? She had to know, where is Old Dolores? Who is the author? She's asking everyone. She's sending out letters. She's talking to every cowboy she knows, every river rat. And somebody replied, they think that he's an attorney in Colorado. An attorney? No, that's impossible. He has to be a cowboy tall in the saddle. He wrote this song in the saddle. And she continues with her search. And then in 1956, May 31, she gets a letter from James Grafton Rogers, apologizing for the delay, but letters had gone through the grapevine and were forwarded to him, and that's how he knew that she was looking for him. And he was saying, let's talk. So he explains where Dolores is as best he can, but it has been a long time since he's been there. And Katie's insistent, she keeps asking questions. And so he sent his son Hamilton down to where Dolores, the remains of Dolores are. And that's just south of Santa Fe, south of Cerrillos. And so Hamilton is a dutiful son and goes all the way down there and gets on those back roads and he finds what remains of old Dolores and takes that back to his father. Katie, she goes down there herself and raised a few eyebrows when she's driving around in this white Cadillac convertible out in these dusty dirt roads and asking, where's old Dolores? And while she's there, she gets to know Susie Henderson, who is a typist and is typing the manuscripts for Mark Simmons, who was the chronicler of the Santa Fe Trail. He wrote almost 50 books on the Santa Fe Trail and other places of the Southwest. And Mark was a friend of mine, and that's how I got to know about Susie. And another friend of Mark's is Archie West, and Archie and I have gone to Susie's house, her adobe house, which still stands. And I took a picture of Archie in front of that adobe house and sent it to Katie Lee because she had spent several nights there. This was back when Katie was still living. Well, I was going through the archives at the History of Colorado. There's 14 boxes of James Grafton Rogers papers. Within, I found a letter, 1958, from Katie Lee, asking permission from James to sing Old Dolores in her upcoming book. There's a mention of this book in Arizona Highways in 1960. There's about a 6-7 page article by Katie about this book that she's going to publish, and the title was going to be Songs the Cowboys Taught Me. This was the title that was requested by a rather outstanding publisher who I will not mention. And if you know Katie, she gets set in her ways, they butted heads, the whole thing fell apart. And it wasn't until 1976 that she found a publisher, Northland Press, out of Flagstaff, and titled the book the way she wanted it to be, 10,000 Goddamn Cattle, which is actually the title of a cowboy song. Well, that was the start of her search for these cowboy songs. And that book is an excellent book, an excellent collection of cowboy songs, but it is unique in that from cover to cover, there's all these songs that are put throughout the book, but there's also her search to try to find Old Dolores all through that book. She wrote that book the way she wanted to do it. In time, Katie would live in Aspen, and she would have a bit of a commute, sometimes between Aspen and Denver. And any time that she was passing by Georgetown, she would not fail to stop and see her friends, James and Cora. She would look for Roger's Jeep. When she was in Georgetown, she knew if she could find his Jeep, she could find him. She called him Pappy. She loved that man. There was one of those conversations where Rogers told Katie that he wrote plays under the pseudonym Roger West. Have any of you heard that before?
Mm-mm.
I've looked, and I've tried to find any writings by Roger West. Part of the problem today is there is a popular singer and songwriter who has taken up the name Roger West, and so that muddies the waters. Everything you look for, that's who you find. But I'm telling you, look for Roger West, and maybe we can find some more of his writings. Okay, now I'm moving to 1981, Colorado School of Mines Physics Department. I'm taking up work there. And there's a physicist and a folk singer, Dick Yates, who befriends me, and he's from Arizona. And one of the first things he asks me is, have you heard of James Grafton Rogers? And I took note even at the time, interesting that he felt it necessary to include that middle name. And it was from him that I got the first words to the Santa Fe Trail on a mimeograph sheet that I still have. Well, I learned of Old Dolores from Harry Tuft, who was the founder of the Denver Folklore Center. And Harry learned it from a singer named Mag Hayden, who's a friend of both of ours. Mag was friends of the grandchildren of James and Cora. I don't know if you know Mag, but she tells me she would run around and play. She was of the Davis family, and so she would run around with the grandchildren. She learned the song through those kids. That's how she learned it. And then in 2005, Mark Lee Gardner and we recorded the CD Frontier Favorites. And as kind of the grand finale of this, we include the Santa Fe Trail. Then in 2010, I put together a solo CD, and I wanted to record Old Dolores. Well, I want to do like Katie and ask someone in the family. Well, James and Cora are gone. Ranger, Lorna, Hamilton, they're gone. But I was able to find James, Grafton, Rogers, Hart, and Barbara. And I asked permission to record that song and was told, yes, you bet, on behalf of Peter. their family, they always referred to James as Pete. I remember that. So it's on my Ladies' Choice CD, and on that blue table right next to the door where you came in, there are stacks of them. There are more than enough for everyone here. Take some for a friend if you like, but you can take my recording of Old Dolores with you. But I did it to the actual original words that I found in the History Colorado archives. So they're a little different. There's no Ramon pouring drinks. There's no red peppers hanging. But it's the original words to Old Dolores. And when I got that roughed out, I sent a recording to Katie Lee. She didn't like it. She said, you know, you feel like you need to really work on this. You're not really comfortable with it. You need to work on it some more. And so I took that to heart, and I went on a hunting trip, horseback trip, out in Gunnison, and I was out there for about a week, and I got back home, and I had a different form, and I had it. So this is it. And I sent that to her, and she didn't like it. She loved it, except she didn't like how I kind of put in this dramatic pause at the end of the verses. And I said, you know what? I'm going to stand my ground. This is how it's going to go. And she forgave me. I first sang this to James and Barbara at Bensold Fort, out on the parapet, as the sun was going down behind the distant mountains. So they would hear it for one of the first people to hear my version of it. And then in 2021, there was the Santa Fe Trail Bicentennial and Symposium that went all along the trail from Old Franklin, Missouri, out along the trail into Santa Fe. And I was involved in different events along that time, presented historic papers, did presentations of the historic music and the story of the Santa Fe Trail, and I sang the Santa Fe Trail a lot that year. We got sung all through those states. Well, now I want to get to those songs, because I know some people would be disappointed if I didn't sing a couple songs before I left. But I want to talk about the songs themselves before I get to them. The Santa Fe Trail. James himself says that he wrote it in 1912. Other people say that's when he wrote it. But in those archives, in those papers of James Rogers, I found a handwritten paper. Actually, it's like 4 pages. And on that date, the date that's written on those papers is 1908. So which one is correct? I've heard from others that that song was inspired by James working in the Arkansas River Valley, working on water rights for Native Americans and Hispanics. And I would like to find a more concrete source for that information, if you should find that. But what I have heard from James himself was that he was working as a lawyer for an irrigated land project near Los Animas. And I think that's really the source for it. This was in 1911. And yet we have this paper, 1908. But James says that he was down there in Los Animas in 1911. Then there's Old Dolores. And people say that Old Dolores was written in 1912. James himself, he told Katie that he was working on that project in Los Animas, and it was through that he received an invitation to go on a Fred Harvey. Anybody remember the Harvey Railroad?
Mm-hmm.
He was invited to go on the Fred Harvey Railroad trip to Santa Fe, and from there they were going to be taken in these coaches, these cars, to the old town of Dolores, the old mining camp. And he says that was in 1912, and yet in the History Colorado archives, I found a typewritten paper, all one sheet, with handwritten corrections of Old Dolores with the date 1910. So that's some of the history that I have on the songs. One more thing about those songs. A number of them show up in what's called a Golden Treasury, which is from the University Club. These are hard to come by,
Yeah.
but I found one. And James said at one point that he sent one to Katie Lee. I don't know if she ever got that. But within this is a number of songs and poems by James Grafton Rogers. There's even one by Ranger in here. And then there's one that's not by either one of them. And it says in the book that it was sung by Stanley Johnson. And I haven't quite nailed down just who Stanley Johnson is. But the title is The Dean of the Santa Fe Trail, sung to the air Santa Fe Trail. Say, bud, have you heard of Jim Rogers, the Dean of the Santa Fe Trail? I'm shooting low into young codgers up at Boulder an hour by rail. And Daddy and Ma in the mule seat. And speaking of railroads reminds me, I've told you just how it will happen in a snappy 400-page brief. Oh, in a snappy 400-page brief. Dean Pound is to me always Roscoe, and Hutchins I always call Bob. And except for the tunnel fiasco, I'm smarter than most of that mob. In national life I'm a figure. In Washington no one is curt. I'm planning to call Hughes plain Charlie, and Hoover I'm bound to call Bert. Oh, and Hoover I'm bound to call Bert. The Dean of the Santa Fe Trail. And I wonder about that tunnel fiasco that he's referring to, because that's not the Eisenhower Tunnel. This is before 1953. This banjo was made in England, in Birmingham, about the same time that James was born, 1883. And I felt like I would include this one here just as a nod to Robert Rogers. And you know this song. Say, part of you Saturday summer, ahead in the Santa Fe Trail. You made it here Monday or soon, with a waterhead worked on the tail. With Daddy and Ma on the middle seat, and somewhere around on the way, a tow-headed gal on a pinto, a jingling for old Santa Fe. Yo-ho. A jingling for old Santa Fe. I've seen her ride down the arroyos, way back in the Arkansas sun, with a smile like an acre of sunflowers, and a little brown quirk in her hand. She straddled the pinto so merry, and rode like she carried the mail, and her eyes near set down to the prairie, alongside of the Santa Fe Trail. Yo-ho, long side of the Santa Fe Trail. I know a gal down on the border that I'll ride to El Paso to sight. I'm acquainted with the high step in the water, and I sometimes just don't get good night. And the old girl fuffles and beaten, or afternoon tea by the pail, compared to this kind of stampede I got on the Santa Fe Trail. Yo-ho, that I got on the Santa Fe Trail. I don't know an ape and the prairie when it comes to a gal's pretty wild. It's closer from hell to hilarity than it is on the Santa Fe ride. By sundown, and a swale. Oh, come on, a gal and a painter on the side of the Santa Fe. Yo ho, long side of the Santa Fe. Santa Fe Trail. And now I have to do the song that sent Katie Lee on her great song search. And when I was playing it for you all at Bedsford, I was playing it on the guitar, and I played it on the guitar on the CD. But it works on the banjo too. In the country down below, where little pinions grow, and it's half a day to water. We used to stand in town where a creek can come down from a mesa where it surely had an altar. The streets were bright with candlelight. The whole town joined the chorus. Every man in sight led his cavalry through the night, just a Moses to the town of old Dolores. And things would kind of spin till the sun came up again, like the back of some yellow prairie wagon. And show you dim red, maybe 100 head of a sleepy saddle pony's raging dragon. The painted walls and waterfalls, the whole wide world before us. But the adobe walls are gone and the old bells are gone, ain't the jingling in the streets of old Dolores. Oh, the Spanish girls are fool in the plaza and cool, and there's one I ain't forgotten, her mantilla. For in almost any girl said a puncher's head of whirl when the Santa used the saddles for a pillow. The bright-eyed stars, the long cigars, the smiles that wave before us. If there's any little bell down inside the gates of hell, or the kiss of boys would name the old Dolores. That is all Dolores. And I thank you all for coming. Thank you for inviting me here, and be happy to entertain any questions that you may have.
I'm wondering, Cora Lou, did you hear, the Rogers used to come and visit your folks, didn't they?
I'm sorry, what?
Didn't the Rogers come and visit your folks when they were in town?
That I can't tell you, Wendy.
I'm sure, yeah, we have great memories of all the family and the house and everything.
Okay. I seem to remember somebody saying that, did he play the organ or piano?
I don't know, maybe Jim did once or twice.
Okay.
Church, I don't know.
Yep. Well, it's wonderful.
My memories of Jim Rogers was, and before I was delivering groceries to them down at the house, and then I always got to swing on that wonderful swing that never made a sound. It just like floating in the air. So he delivered to them, I'm sure, twice a week or more.
What year did Jerry Buckley move the house?
Well, it would have been mid-60s, wasn't it, when they're putting the road in, mid to late.
You think he did?
What year did they move it?
Yeah,
Oh, it was moved in '65.
yeah. And it would have sat about where the westbound exit is now. That's that aspen grove in there.
Yes, we were talking about that today, speculating where it did that. Where was it?
Well, we've got,
That's where I remember it's being playing and wandering all around that and up the gully on the east side especially, and one rock that looked like a saddle.
You know, my friend, our friend Dwayne Smith always said that somehow my Rocky Mountain Valley needs to get reprinted. And one of these days, if there's, I have no idea. I assume family probably would hold the rights to that. I don't know. I think it was one of the Pruitt Press or somebody. But at this point in time, when you move to town, a lot of people go out on Amazon or eBay to look for copies of my Rocky Mountain Valley. It's sort of a rite of passage for living here. But it's a wonderful book.
I don't know, I know with Old Dolores, and I think also with Santa Fe Trail, Peter never copyrighted them.
Okay.
I don't know if the book was copyrighted or not. But his feeling was, and it kind of goes along with everything you've been talking about, Rex. So much of it is passed from one person to another, and very openly all the way around. And that was Peter's feeling. Pass it on. Whoever wants to do something with it, let him do it. And I've heard so many different versions of those two songs.
Mm-hmm.
So have I.
The version that I first learned, I learned from George Downing, who said he learned it from Judy Collins, whose father was in radio at that point in time, and you would have known in Denver, and all of that. So who knows? And like any good story or any good yarn, it does change through a generation, a word here or there.
James said to Katie Lee that he was in Peru and he saw a motion picture while he was there, and it had his song, the Santa Fe Trail, that was sung, it was in Spanish.
Wow.
So it gets around.
Well, the records that are at the State Historical Society are wonderful, and I went through as I was writing a book on 20th century Georgetown, and well, a couple of things. First of all, I love the fact that this man who worked with the all of these huge international projects becomes mayor of Georgetown, and he's got to deal with Bernard Buckley not tying up his horse, and a couple of people who refuse to pay their water bills. And I've often wondered, you just had to walk, you go from there. But within that collection is a 2 or 3 page plan for historic structures and what History Colorado, or then Colorado Historical Society, should do. There should be a railroad site, which he said this one, and there should be and Fort Garland and others, and a lot of those have come to pass. But it's an impressive list, and I think probably History Colorado needs to pull those out again and give a little bit of credit to the gentleman who got a lot of that started in the 50s.
I remember Peter and Dad working very hard to get the Georgetown loop while they were in History Colorado, which at that point was the Colorado Historical Society.
Right.
And also I remember they were working very hard to get the dam built down here to stop the Clear Creek floods, which were so horrible sometimes.
And the people in Idaho Springs, after the dam burst one time, Price Briscoe, who was Polly and Jane's father, saying he didn't really see much need to put in another dam just for a bunch of damn fish. Anyway.
Well, see what's come of it.
But it's so wonderful to have you here. This is
it's just a delight for all of us. And Rex, I learned so much about my own grandfather, who I studied off and on for years. I really appreciate that.
It's been a pleasure. It's been a fun search.
I think it goes both ways, it's a pleasure.
yes.
So I think it goes both ways as a pleasure. I think we're always open to hear more things about Jimmy Cora Rogers.
Yeah.
And, it's just they were such wonderful people, such a core part of the heart of our town, that we're always open to know more about it.
We've come across some new pictures that are part of the Missoula collection, that Fred Missoula's collection went to Eamon Carter because everybody in Colorado was mad at him. And then History Colorado brought them back, but a lot of them, they just say a man in front of the Hotel de Paris. It's like, no, we know who that is. So we've got to, we need to get more credit to him. That's great. And but you guys called him Peter?
Yeah, and none of us have any idea where that came from. Maybe it was a Secret Service or OSS pseudonym
Yeah.
for him.
Yeah.
I just thought of that.
Yeah.
Maybe that was
Maybe
it.
that was.
I don't know. I have a question also. When I came up to visit Cora and Peter and I would often walk into town, and we'd always stop at this one little cabin below and west of the Aspen Grove, and it was owned by George Old. Does anybody know that name?
Yeah,
George
sure.
Old?
He's down in Alvarado.
And I got an orange every time we visited there.
Right.
He gave me an orange.
So the old, well,
It was just wonderful.
the old family, old or olds, it's both ways, were who built the house, who built Aspen Grove. That was Robert Orchard Olds. And so I would guess that probably a son or a nephew or somebody might have had the property next to it. Yeah, I can show you where the grave is in Alvarado. Where's the family buried? Is there a burial plot?
Oh, I should know.
Oh, it's fine. I don't mean to pry. It's me, and I'm one of those that goes out like, well, where?
Morbid
Who's where?
getting around.
Yeah.
Halloween time. No, I ought to know, and I don't.
I wondered if they went back east, if they were buried back east, but
Might be.
Yeah.
Might be.
anyway, I don't really need to know. I'm not gonna go down and commune over the spirit of. But sometimes it gives you other dates that relate to other people.
Yeah, unfortunately, I was not here either when Cora died or when Peter died. So,
And what was she like? She's
she
the
was
mystery to me.
very strong. She always told me, among other things, stand up straight, Jim. And whenever we'd be walking up the hill, she'd say, stand up straight. And I guess I didn't learn that lesson very well. But she was very quiet. She let Peter have the stage wherever they went.
Yeah.
Peter would have taken it anyway, but she was the kind of person who allowed him to grow and to influence people, and I'm sure in their private conversations she had a lot to say, a lot to add. She was a quite brilliant, patient, loving person herself. Sang in the opera.
That's cool.
I think in
Central City,
I know in Denver,
Yeah.
for sure.
Huh.
And the organ, I never heard anybody play the organ, but it was always there, and I, worked the pedals, but nobody ever played it.
It's wonderful to have you. And Rex, how great to have you. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, it's been a pleasure. Don't forget, there's copies of Old Dolores on my CD there. And take a couple if you know somebody that wants to hear the song. Go right ahead.
That's wonderful.
Yes.
I'm curious, how did you reunite with the family? How did all this come about? Have you known each other before?
Well, no, I think the first time we met was at Old Ben's Fort, wasn't it?
I think that was right. It was just a coincidence that we bumped into each other there. I was trying to think, how did I find you? And I believe Ben's Fort is a good place to meet people.
Yeah, it was wonderful, and having so many of the same interests, and then the Katie Lee connection, which I only met her once, but it was a momentous meeting, and I've always loved her. Her book, 10,000 Goddamn Cattle, and the CD that she made from it. It's just a marvelous CD of Western songs.
Before it was a CD, it was an LP, released in 26 with the book, released in 1976 with the book.
We had a program last year put on by Professor Gulliford from Fort Lewis, and it was a program on bear's ears. A lovely program, and the last slide he had was a picture we all recognized, and he said, anybody know who this is? And we're going, Katie Lee, and he's like, what? It was a scantily, if any, clad Katie Lee in bear's ears, and he said, yeah, you want to know her connection to Georgetown? And he was just gobsmacked. That was fun.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.